Hello and welcome to the CPX podcast. It's Greg Clark here, and today I have in my studio with me Ross Gittins, something of an economics guru in Australia, and I can remember sleeping on a railway station as a high school student just to get to a lecture on economics to hear Ross speak. Thanks for being here, Ross.
My pleasure.
He's spent about 30 years as a writer for the Sydney Morning Herald and now for The Age, and he's the author of the book Gittinomics, Living the Good Life Without Money, Stress, Overwork and Joyless Consumption. Gee, that sounds like a recipe for utopia, Ross.
You got the comma in the wrong place. It's without money stress.
Without money stress. Well, that
it's
makes
not
a
without
difference,
money.
Doesn't it? That must be my kind of monkish background coming through there and disappear to the desert. Yeah. Now, you've written about economics as a field for so long, but it seems to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger as a field. I mean, its scope seems to be growing. It seems to be becoming more of a human science. I mean, it deals with things like happiness research now, for example. Is that what's going on, or have I missed the point?
Well, that's partly what's going on. It's certainly true that a small but growing number of economists are interested in the topic of happiness, as I am. But it's also, but I guess it's closer to the truth to say that economics is imperialist. And it would really like to take over the rest of the world. And we'd like to, or they, because I'm not really an economist, they would like to have everything, all parts of our lives decided the way economists decide things. So
theology was meant to be the queen of the
is a good idea.
Wasn't it theology was meant to be the queen of the sciences?
Yeah, well, not anymore.
Now, you say you're not an economist. How would you describe yourself?
I describe myself as a journalist who writes about economics. I want people to think of me as a journalist, not an economist. Everybody does, and because I talk about economics so much, people think I'm an economist, but I'm really a journalist.
Now, your economic writing, though, has had a huge impact on the public, but what sort of impacts it had on your own soul? Have you got a more pessimistic view of human nature now you've been writing about economic behaviour for so long, or how's it affected you?
I wouldn't say it's made me more pessimistic. The wider I read about human nature, in some respects, the more optimistic I get.
Really?
Yes, because in fact, economics takes a very pessimistic view of people, that they are self-interested, that they are hugely competitive, with the implication that they're not very cooperative. But as I've read wider, I've realised that people are on about a lot more than just self-interest, that there's a lot of altruism there, that we do things for a whole multiplicity of motives and not just looking after ourselves and our nearest. And also that we do cooperate a lot. In fact, the economy is built on cooperation. Sometimes economists forget that, and they do better if they remembered it more often. But really, if we're all just at each other, we wouldn't get nearly as far as we've got. A lot of what we've constructed in the material world has come through cooperation.
And are those kinds of ideas really contributing now to the way economists think?
A bit, but not as much as they should. I think that economists suffer from what I call model blindness, that it's just too easy. Every profession suffers from model blindness. You know, doctors think that all problems are medical and all problems can be solved with a pill, unless they're a surgeon, in which they can be solved by chopping something off. And economists think that economic solutions will fix everything. Of course, it's not right, but it's just the way people think in professions, because we've become more specialised. See, one of the ways we've become richer as a society, more prosperous, one of the ways our material standard of living has risen enormously over the past 200 years or longer, is through getting more and more specialised. The trouble with that is that it puts us all into little boxes where we understand our own box very well, but we have terrible trouble imagining what's going on in other people's boxes.
And knowledge does seem to be more interconnected than that disciplinary approach would allow, doesn't it?
It does, and economists are not very good. It's changing slowly, but economists are not very good at interdisciplinary work.
We might come back to that a little bit, but you've lived through some big economic changes in Australian society, floating of the dollar, GST, the super reforms and so forth. Is there anything you would label as having the biggest impact on the Australian economy?
In my time, yes. The biggest was all the reforms that Paul Keating introduced as Treasurer, which include a lot of the ones that you mentioned. And he wouldn't like us to remind him of it, but at one stage he was going to introduce the GST as well. So those really changed the economy in interesting ways, in ways that I believe have contributed greatly to our material prosperity. In other words, we are running the economy far more efficiently with less waste than we were 10, 20 or 30 years ago. I don't doubt that. But also in ways that are less humane and ways that have chopped out valuable things that economists don't see because they're not in the model.
So we've become more efficient, but at too big a cost?
Well, at a considerable cost, and I don't think any of us quite realise that. One of the things that we've lost is trust. Another thing that we've lost, as we've made, a lot of what the economic rationalists were on about, led by Paul Keating, was to increase competition, to make Australia more competitive, to force people to try harder, to put more pressure on people. That's happened. But there are a lot of consequences that go with that aren't very good. I think one of the things that's gone by the board, not just in Australia, but I guess in all the developed countries, is a concept of professionalism. When you call someone a professional today, what you're saying is they do it for the money. They're paid. They're not unpaid. They're not amateurs. Or another way we mean is they're very good at their job. They know what they're doing. They know exactly how to get the boat into port without any mishaps. They're very proficient at their job. They're professional. The old meaning of professional was, I put my client's interests ahead of my own. That was the old meaning. That's gone. There are people who profess to that, but usually they're just saying that as a cover for advancing their own interests. The idea that and the reason for that is the competitiveness. It's the reason why, for example, crowds like rating agencies have and auditors. I used to be an auditor, and you remember that one very big international firm of auditors really destroyed themselves over those events with some of those company collapses in America, and they just went out backwards. They were actually, in their day, regarded as the most professional, the people with the highest standards. They used to walk down the street with their nose in the air, thinking that they were better than all the other CPAs. And that in the end, they got almost literally caught with their hand in the till. Why was that? Because they were sitting there being terribly ethical, doing the right thing, acting in the interests of the shareholders, not the management, which is why you have auditors, and seeing all the management really loading themselves up with money. And they thought, why can't we have some? And that's when the real professionalism dropped away and they became more entrepreneurial, as you might call it, and standards slipped. And in the end, standards slipped so badly that they were kind of hounded out of office.
So this leads us to, I guess, the big issue of our times, the global financial crisis, and that sort of thing that you're talking about seems to be happening in all sorts of areas now. Has this event, the GFC, it even has its own acronym now, has it changed any of your fundamental ideas about economics and about human behaviour and what we should do?
No, it hasn't fundamentally, and I fear that it won't change the world as much as you might expect. There's a fortunate reason for that, because it won't, however bad it is, it won't be as bad as the Great Depression. I think the Great Depression changed the world dramatically,
Right.
But I don't think this event will.
Why is that?
Because it won't be as bad, is the short answer. And because it won't be as bad, attitudes, ideologies, vested interests will survive. They'll take a bit of a hit, but they'll come back. We'll learn something from this. I think we'll regulate our banks and our financial institutions more closely. Australia, in fact, did regulate its banks and financial institutions more carefully. That's the reason why we're not in nearly as much trouble as the Americans and the Europeans. And I think they're quite envious of the way we kept our banks in line and stopped them doing silly things. So I think that's part of it. But when you learn lessons from busts, they last as long as it takes for us to have another boom, when another younger generation get dollar signs in their eyes and they do the self-same thing. If you've been around for a few recessions, you see it each time. It's a cycle.
So you think we learn the most, or we're most in touch with ourselves when we're affluent or when we're suffering? What
Definitely. I think you learn much more from your mistakes than from your successes. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think it's hard to learn when you're affluent and successful, and much easier to learn when you're facing hard times. It's easier to learn when you get things taken away from you. And you're terribly apprehensive about that. People are always apprehensive about losing income. They think the world is going to become much worse. Well, actually, what the psychologists find is that everybody overestimates that there is in humans an enormous amount of resilience, and most of the time we bounce back. And when either very good things that we've been looking forward to and longing for happen, they don't permanently lift our spirits the way we imagined they would, but it works in the reverse as well. When something quite bad happens, you lose your job. Losing your job's a bad example, because it's one of the ones that really knocks people around. Because it's not just the loss of money, it's the loss of self-esteem, because so much of our esteem, particularly for men, comes from their employment.
Yes.
But in many other ways, we can lose things that we imagine will make us terribly unhappy for the rest of our lives, and it doesn't. We recover. We go back to a new equilibrium, as an economist would say.
So you don't think we're going to see the terrible levels of unemployment over time like the Great Depression?
I don't. No. That would involve unemployment getting to 20%. That'd be twice as bad as the worst we've had.
The Prime Minister has kicked into this whole discussion of the GFC with his essay in the Monthly, and then the follow-up essays that have been published in this month's edition. I wonder what your take is. That there's been a whole range of responses, from very high praise to round condemnation of him. What's your take on the Prime Minister's view of what's going on?
I have to confess that I attempted to read the 7,000 words and didn't make it very far.
I don't think you're alone. How many thousand did you get in?
But, I felt like I'd heard a lot of it before. But I wasn't impressed. I think that there was a lot of political point scoring there. It was meant to be about high ideology. I think Kevin Rudd, I've always believed Kevin Rudd is not a very ideological person at all. He's capable of turning on these wonderful essays where he talks about Bonhoeffer and all this kind of stuff, but I don't really think that's Kevin Rudd. And I think that he couldn't resist the temptation to try and score a few points off his political opponents, and so I wasn't terribly impressed by that effort at all. And the idea that he and Labor are these sort of social democrats, when the man's been running around saying he's a fiscal conservative and an economic conservative, I don't believe that. This guy is not much of a social democrat at all. Neither is he much of a neoliberal. He's sort of flopping around between them, as the occasion demands, and as he thinks the votes will be attracted.
Well, no one, including the Prime Minister, saw this kind of crisis coming along. I mean, I know there are a few voices out there raising warning signs and so forth, but it seemed to be a surprise to most economists. Is that a fair
Oh,
thing
yes,
to
it
say?
is.
Yeah,
It is. And that's an interesting criticism of economics. If you know anything about macroeconomics, the economics of whole economies, you know that they move in cycles. You would think that economists would put an enormous amount of emphasis on studying the cycle and understanding cycles and being able to predict cycles, but they don't. They don't.
Why is that?
Well, because they're mainly influenced by the microeconomic model, and by what you might call pre-Keynesian economics, neoclassical macroeconomics, which assumes that the economy is always in equilibrium and that you don't really have cycles. And if you have unemployment, it's just a temporary hiccup, which the economy, if you leave it alone, will fix. And you can hear people saying that today. If you read the right newspapers, and by right I mean with a capital R, you can see a tiny band of very noisy economists really saying, look, government should be just sitting back and letting this recession work itself out naturally. And that's what they were saying. That's what the economics profession was saying right through the Great Depression, until Keynes came along and said, no, that's all wrong. The economy won't right itself. We've got to intervene to fix it. Now, most economists believe that they'll argue about the details, but they believe that the government should intervene to manage economies. Surprisingly, you can hear these echoes of all this pre-Great Depression economics. You can see it coming from seemingly sensible people to this day, but they're very much in the minority. If you look at the economic commentary about the Rudd government and all the stimulus and all the money that it's been spending, most economists will say that's fine. Yes, of course, spend the money. They'll then go on to say, yes, but we've got to get everything back. We've got to get the budget back to surplus. They don't worry about debts nearly as much as they worry about getting back to surplus, I might add. Because every country but Australia always runs a big debt and nobody worries about it. In Australia, ironically, because we managed for the briefest period of our history to get rid of our debt, everyone in Australia has decided that that's the natural order, and if the government's got any kind of debt, there's something terribly wrong, and it must be fixed by tomorrow.
Debt is a four-letter word. Now, you've given something of your view there on the GFC and its origins and so forth, but can you summarise, is it really a failure of various financial instruments and so forth, or is there something deeper going on? Because, God botherers like us, we're quick to say, well, there's human greed, there's something spiritual wrong here. Is that your view, or is it just a failure of the system?
Well, of course there's greed involved. I think it's actually more complicated than that. I think when you see, there's an old saying that the share market runs on greed or fear and it flips from one to the other. Well, that's kind of true. But if that's all you knew about the share market, you'd be much more likely to be a victim than a winner out of it. So I don't think it tells you very much to say this was a product of greed. And greed comes in different forms. Why did all these people in the financial markets do all these crazy things, run all these risks, rack up all this debt? And of course, when you're in debt, and you do risky things, you become terribly vulnerable. That's really why the thing has fallen over in New York to such an extent, because they did risky things while they were hugely indebted, and those two do not go together easily. But why were they doing it? They would tell you part of the reason is because we've got all these people on our back telling us to make bigger profits. So you can say that we're greedy, but we reckon the people who are whipping us are greedy. Now, let me ask you a question. How many times have you picked up your annual superannuation statement and looked at it and you get a kind of result? They say our profits were 12% this year. And how many times have you thought, I wish that 12% was 20% or 15%? If you've had that wish, then that makes you as greedy as those guys.
You're part of the problem.
Yes. Yeah. And they think the part of the reason why they're doing what they're doing is because people representing you are whipping them along to get better results. And the part of the reason for that is both they and us don't see the human consequences of our actions because the economy has become so complicated. It doesn't. When we have a thought that says this fund's paying 10%, this one's doing better and paying 15%, I'll move. It never occurs to us that we may be encouraging actions that are causing people to be laid off, but we may well be doing that.
It's like moving away from your favourite petrol station to another one just because it's 1 cent cheaper there, and you're not going to meet your friend who serves you petrol every morning. There's been a great loss, probably worth a lot more than the 1 cent that you're saving per litre by going to the other one.
That's very true. But you actually make a point about how the economic model fails, because most people faced with that choice would continue to shop at the at the service station where they know the people and get a friendly reaction.
Because that is more important to them.
Because it is more important to them.
Brings me to your own writing in Gittinomics and some of the ideas you've expressed there. You say in the book that we seem to spend too much time on the things that don't satisfy us and less time on the things that do, if we've understood what you're saying there. What is it that truly satisfies the human being? What should the economist be interested in? What is our quest for satisfaction?
Relationships are the most important, but satisfying work is also very important.
Human occupation?
Yes. I mean, we are a creature made to work, and we are happiest when we're doing work, but ideally it needs to be satisfying work. Fortunately, not all of us have to be brain surgeons to be satisfied with the intellectual demands of our work. There are people who don't want to do work that's very intellectually demanding, and they can get satisfaction from that. Part of that is whether they get a bit of freedom to decide how they'll do the job. That's very important, and that has a big influence not only on people's happiness but also on their health, their physical health. So work is very important, but really it's relationships. They are the most important, and they're the things that are easiest to neglect. And we can rationalise it. All the people who work very long hours and don't see nearly as much of their kids will tell you they're doing it for their kids. Actually, they're probably doing it to maintain a standard of living, to be able to send their kids to private schools, to be able to live in a good house in a well-regarded suburb, to be able to drive a late model imported car, all those kind of things. And if they're very unlucky, their kids can get hooked on that, and they can be putting pressure on them to say, keep it up. My mate gets pocket money of $50. How come you're only giving me 10?
It's a complicated kind of mixture of human desires there, isn't it? That you're summarising your subtitle of money stress and being overworked and not having the balance that you're looking for.
That's right. And if you get too deeply into that, you really have to find ways to pull back. Often not easy ways, but I think it's best to do that. It's not, and your kids won't really thank you for neglecting them, so that you could continue to give them $50 a week pocket money. They won't. Even, no matter what they said about why don't you give me more money, they really. And I think this kids often make this clear. I just want to see my dad.
Well, Ross, in the book you reveal a bit about your own family life. Talk about your father being a Salvation Army preacher. Do you think that kind of Salvo's background has had any impact on how you think about the world and how you go about your work?
Oh, I think it's had an enormous impact. I think that my background, my upbringing, stands out from my work. It stands out like organ stops, as a central banker used to say.
And your work's changed quite a bit over the years. We've, since I've been doing the high school certificate and following your writing, I've noticed a shift. Perhaps you could tell me if this is a fair summary. You seem to have moved from a sort of defender of economic rationalism to something more of a critic of economic rationalism. Is that too much of an HSC economics student's summary or not?
No, you've got that very well, although I have to say that if you looked at the stuff that I aim particularly at school students and students generally, you'd find that it hadn't changed all that much, because their syllabus hasn't changed all that much. It's when you see the stuff that I write for the mums and dads that you see the change. And it is true. I've become much less an advocate of economic rationalism and much more a deliverer of a critique. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is I think I understand the topic a lot better. I read a lot more widely. I'm a lot more conscious of the limitations of economics than I was. I feel that I can actually make a more valuable contribution by highlighting those things than just by banging away. There are any number of commentators and economic urges out there preaching the one true gospel, the one true economic gospel. So that's part of it. That's a big part of it.
One last question for you. I've noticed in my reading about medicine, patient treatment and so forth, that spirituality plays a role now. It's kind of known from the hard research that a patient's spiritual perspective on things affects their pathways of healing and so forth. I don't want to overstate that, but it's there in the evidence that
yes, it
it's
is
one of the factors.
Oh yes, it's there, all right, and it's in my next book.
It's in your next book. Oh well, you may want to talk about this. I didn't set you up for this. Is it evident in economics as well? Do you need to plug in people's spirituality as a factor in economic discussions?
Well, we should, but we don't. It's not in the model. I mean, the model abstracts from a whole host of things that we kind of assumed weren't all that important. We kind of assumed, for example, that air was infinitely available, that water was infinitely available, and you didn't have to worry about them terribly much. And of course, we've discovered exactly the reverse, that the clean air is in very short supply, especially in a big smoggy city, and water is an enormous problem. And so, in other words, there are a lot of things that economists call externalities. They're outside the model, but that economist has to acknowledge that those things are important, even though the model can't cope with them, because the model has simplified the world down and left them out. There are a lot of those things, and one of them is spirituality, very much so.
Is it possible? Can we quantify it in a way that's going to make sense into the future to do economic modelling better with people's spiritual views in there?
No, that's one of the problems. One of the bad things about economists is that they've become very formal, as they would say, or what we would say is mathematical. And if you can point to something that's important, like even something as obvious as confidence, consumer confidence, business confidence, that's fine. That's fine. Until you can get it into an equation, I don't want to know about it.
Well, Ross, it's been a pleasure talking with you, conversing, not doing maths, not doing economics, not sleeping on a railway station to wait for you to lecture. So thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.